Welcome to the Center for the Virtual Study of the United States Constitution with your host, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Good afternoon. This is Bill O'Brien, and you are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution on this Wednesday. Today is the 1st of May, or as they say in Europe, it's May Day, and indeed, I believe some of the stock markets in Europe are closed today because it's a holiday. So in other parts of the world, today is indeed a holiday, and many of you, like me, grew up during the height of the Cold War, and you remember that there used to be a big parade in Moscow every May 1st to celebrate May Day, and the Soviet Union would show off its military might with cannon and trucks and high-stepping military and all the rest of it. It is a beautiful day here in southern West Virginia. I presume that you are having a beautiful day as well, and I guess as I get older, I have to say that every day is a beautiful day, because the alternative is not too good. There may not be one. So we need to cherish each day as it comes to us and enjoy it and look for the positives. We welcome you to the program. And as I mentioned on Monday, we were talking a little bit about the story behind the American movement for independence. I want to get back and revisit that again. But before I do, I want to share with you our phone number, and I understand that we have kind of worked out a few of the gremlins. I think we're taming these things, but be that as it may, we are able to take calls, I understand, today. We'll find out for sure, as many of you will remember that we had a little bit of a problem last time. We had a couple of callers, actually, who were trying to get through and unable to do so. I have my brother listens to the program frequently from New England, and he was telling me that he could hear me saying hello and he could hear the speaker saying hello, and the problem was that we were not able to connect with each other. So I'm hoping that we will have worked those problems out. So with that, let me give you the phone number. The area code is 304, and the number is 658-3333. Kind of easy to remember, 304-658-3333. The email address, if you'd like to email me directly, you may do that. I will be glad. I kind of live on email, so it won't take me too long to respond to you. It might be tomorrow morning. It could be this evening. But my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. And all of that's one word, waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, @gmail.com. And I would love to hear from you, and I will try to do the best I can in terms of responding to you. I know that a number of you listen to these programs after the fact. You record them on iPods or various other devices that I'm not too sure I know all that much about, and listen to them at your leisure. I got an email over the weekend from a listener in British Columbia who's a regular participant in the Horn, and he's in Vancouver, British Columbia, and he said that when we're on live, it's 4 o'clock in the morning there, so or something like that. I know he should be 3 hours earlier, but because he's working, he can't obviously call in at the time. But so he responds with email, and I tried to do the best I could in responding to him with an email. I appreciate that. I appreciate people who take the time to ask questions or raise issues that seem to be raised. I mentioned one the other day about the Gemeinschaft-Gesellschaft thesis, and the listener raised the issue about the issue of generosity or altruism on the one hand and selfishness on the other. And his basic position was, could one take those two terms and do the same thing that Tönnies did with Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft? Could you say that at one extreme is pure altruism, a pure sense of charity, and then on the other hand, pure selfishness, where one is only out for himself? And indeed, you could, the psychological realities are that you could obviously do that and find a very effective way to use those two terms as a way to examine different societies and different cultures in terms of, do they spend more time promoting self-interest, or do they spend significant amounts of time and treasure, tax money, tax breaks, and various other things, encouraging altruism and encouraging kindness for one's neighbor, one's fellow man, the so-called golden rule. And I think that's very significant as well. The issue to keep in mind, of course, is that there is a difference in that Tönnies was not a psychologist as much as he was a sociologist, and he was looking at entire societies and tendencies of groups rather than individual behavior within the groups. And I think Tönnies' position would be that one's behavior as an individual oftentimes was predetermined or controlled, or at least driven, by the membership in the particular society and in the particular group. So by understanding the priorities of the group, you could pretty much expect that the behavior of the individuals within that particular community would tend to be very consistent, and would obviously be somewhat in the direction of altruism. There's no question. Whereas in a Gesellschaft, the same thing would be true. The very mere existence of Gesellschaft would essentially create a set of cultural priorities, social priorities, which would seem to reward certain kinds of self-interested behavior and discourage others. And so chances are that in a Gesellschaft type of society, individual behavior would be characterized more by self-interest than by emphasis on the public interest, and that makes perfect sense as well. Let me, I mentioned to the emailer that if it was all right with him, I would share this with you, because I want to give the kind of attention to the emails that the person who wrote them deserves. I mean, if you take the time to sit down and make a point or put together an argument or a point of view or something like that, and it seems to be something that would add to our overall understanding of the issue at hand, then I would like to share it with our listeners, even if you can't. And I did get an email back from this person in British Columbia who gave me permission to do it and said, by all means, whatever you feel like doing and need to do, please feel free to do. So that's what I'm doing. And the reason I want to do that is because there's one point I want to make, and it's one of those things, and this is what makes, I'll be honest with you, this is what makes learning so very exciting. This is what makes me wonder what's happening in our schools when so many of our youngsters find school and the whole process of learning boring. And I'm wondering what it is that we do to make that true, because learning itself is a very exciting thing. And once you begin to experience it, it seems to me, you begin to realize how very exciting it is. And one thing leads logically to the next thing, or the answers to one question should logically generate the next question. And once that begins to happen, you begin to realize that the opportunities are endless, are limitless, and that's what really makes learning so great. That's one of the reasons I love to read Plato, because and I haven't read all of Plato by all means, but I am pretty comfortable, pretty familiar with the Republic. And one of the things that I find interesting is Plato's tremendous enthusiasm and respect for learning and intelligence, and his respect for people who seek to know more. The whole idea of of the human being wanting to know is something that excites Plato, and it excites me as well. And I'm in this room all by myself here, and you can't see this, but I'm waving my arms around, and I'm basically talking about the opportunities for additional knowledge or additional understanding are limitless, and I'm sweeping my arms around in kind of a global thing and all of that. I just find the whole process very, very exciting. But anyway, the point I wanted to make, which is I think is very, very significant. When we talk about altruism, we're talking about generosity. We're talking about charity. And we know, this is just an observation on society in general, we know that Americans, that in American society, we are amongst the world's most generous people. We probably, as a people, give more to charity than any other people in the world. And it's something that we rightly ought to be proud of. And I think many commentators will point to that with pride and with some justification, no question. However, there's something about this that I want to make clear. And I just want you to think about it and reflect upon it, and then we'll get into the main topic for today. But it's something that email from British Columbia generated, and I don't want to lose the thought, if that makes sense, because once you lose it, you've lost it. And it deals with the issue of charity. One of the authors that I have become very, very fond of reading, I find reading him very, very rich, and that's Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. I find Emerson's essays absolutely delightful. I love the way he uses the language. I love his use of the language. He, as they say, he can turn a phrase with the best of them. I think of John Adams's comment about Thomas Jefferson when he is basically acknowledging Jefferson's right to write the Declaration of Independence. And John Adams makes the point that you have Mr. Jefferson, you have a reputation of writing with a masterful pen. I think I've used that before here, and I find that delightful. I just find the language, a person who can make the language sing, who basically takes their given language, in this case English, and can use it so beautifully that it actually is music. It actually becomes music. It becomes exciting to the ears and just pleasant. And that's the way I find Emerson. I find his ideas challenging, but I find his ability to turn a phrase absolutely intriguing. It's something that all of us would do well to try to mimic. We'll never get there. We'll never quite get there to where Emerson was in terms of his ability to write. But it is so beautiful the way he uses the language. And I've always told myself from the time that I started to really enjoy Emerson, which was in college as a sophomore, I began to realize how beautiful our language was when I began to read Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays. But that's neither here nor there. That's a little bit off the point. But if you read Emerson's essay on giving, and he has a number of essays, and one of them is entitled Giving. And if you go on the internet, Google, you can Google anything. But if you go on Google and you just, in parentheses, Giving, Emerson, you will get a copy of his essay on giving. And if you read that very carefully, Emerson's emphasis in his essay is not so much on the recipient of charity as it is on the donor. The old idea, "'tis better to give than to receive," is not meaningless. Emerson's essay on giving exactly makes that point. However, here's the point I would make. Emerson's position is that if we have a real community, if we are in a perfect Gemeinschaft, using Tönnies' terms again, then what we call charity has no place. Because the idea of charity is that we care about our fellow man enough to give to our fellow man a piece of what is ours. Whether it's a cash donation, whether it's food, whether it's clothing, whether it's a roof over their head, whether it's a job, whether it's security, whether it's assistance in building a house, whatever it happens to be, we are giving a portion of what is ours to our neighbors in need. And Lord knows Scripture tells us that we need to do that. Matthew's a Gospel according to St. Matthew tells us to do that in the Beatitudes. That ultimately we have a responsibility to other human beings, to our neighbors, to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. However, the very fact that you do that denies the existence of pure community, of pure Gemeinschaft. Because if we really had pure Gemeinschaft, then nothing in it would belong to any of us. Rather, everything in it would belong to all of us. What I am suggesting is that if we had a pure Gemeinschaft, there would be no need for charity, because everybody would own a piece of whatever is. We talked about that a few weeks ago when we talked about the idea of the commons, and the idea that throughout Western history there has always been the realization that a certain portion of the manor in the medieval period, for example, a certain portion of the manor was considered to be the commons, was considered to be common ownership of all. It belonged to everybody. So therefore, any person who lived within the confines of the manor, who didn't have enough for themselves, could partake of the commons in order to get what they needed. And those who managed the feudal system in the medieval period, who managed the manor, realized that there would always be some people without. And the only way that you could maintain order in community is to make sure that nobody goes without. So therefore, it's to the best interest of everybody to make sure that there's a portion which belongs to everybody so that nobody is ever without, which means nobody has to become desperate enough to begin to take from those who have. But so in a perfect community, in a perfect Gemeinschaft, or as Emerson said, in the perfect community, there would be no such thing as charity, because what's yours would be mine anyway. So let me clarify this, because it's very, very important. What that means is that everybody in the community, as a member of the community, has a right to whatever the community possesses. So in a sense, in helping out your fellow man, you are merely giving them what they have a right to anyway. Now back to the idea of altruism or charity. The whole idea of charity is the idea that I have things that belong only to me, private property. And I choose, out of concern and love for my fellow man, to take a portion of my property and give it to a neighbor in need. While we respect that, I would suggest to you the mere fact that we have to do that we have to encourage charity, suggests that we are not a perfect Gemeinschaft. Because the one thing that we have to realize in a charitable charitable situation where I'm giving a piece of what I own to somebody who doesn't have anything, who is in need, what that essentially implies is that all power in this relationship, whatever power there is in the relationship between me, the giver, and the person to whom I'm giving it, whatever power is involved in our relationship is all on my side. I'm the one who makes the decision to give. I'm the one that makes the decision as to how much I am willing to give. And I'm the one, and this is very important, and I'm the one who expects some sort of a sign of gratitude for the fact that I made that decision to give in the first place. How many times have you heard people who perform an act of charity and then walk away from that act and say, basically, he didn't even thank me, or they didn't even thank me? I don't expect thanks necessarily, but I'd like at least an acknowledgement of the fact that I did something I didn't have to do for them. We feel we have a right to that. What I'm suggesting is all the rights that are involved in a charitable relationship between two people or between a society and those within it who are in need, all power is on one side. By implication, the person in need has no rights. The person in need does not have a right to the charity. He has to depend on the goodwill of those who have what he needs to give portion of it up. In a perfect Gemeinschaft, that would not be the case. Because in a perfect Gemeinschaft, there would be no mine and thine, yours and mine. Everything would be ours. And in theory, if anybody was in need, it was because we're all in need. If a number of us were not in need, then theoretically in a perfect Gemeinschaft, nobody would be in need. The point I'm trying to make is when you consider the word altruism, you're talking about something that is removed from perfect Gemeinschaft. It is part of the movement away from Gemeinschaft towards Gesellschaft. And it's tied up with the idea of private property and personal ownership. It's tied up with modernism. It's linked to modernism. It's linked to Locke and Hobbes and the Enlightenment idea of the state of nature. And it's linked to the concept of private property and the idea of government being the creation of those with property for the protection of their property against those who don't have any. In a perfect Gemeinschaft, that would not be necessary. In a perfect Gemeinschaft, to use James Madison's phrase from Federalist 51, all men would be angels, and therefore no government would be necessary. So the only point I wanted to make in reference to the email is the idea of altruism is not Gemeinschaft. Altruism is somewhere between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Admittedly, it's closer to Gemeinschaft than Gesellschaft. But I would suggest to you that the very existence of altruism suggests that we have moved far enough away from Gemeinschaft that we have reached the point of the idea of private property. Or in Locke's case, in the state of nature, we have begun to assign a dollar value to property. And at that point, people have begun to accumulate property because of its value rather than because of its need. And with the accumulation of that property comes the accumulation of value in terms of dollars. And with the accumulation of those dollars comes the issue of power. And suddenly, the relationships within the community have changed. And we're not talking about a number of citizens, all of whom are equal within the community. Now we are talking about those with the most power, having the most dollars, wielding the most influence, making most of the major decisions. And once that process goes on, then you begin to have a group of people who have nothing and must depend on those with for altruism, for charity. Very, very important issue, it seems to me. And I hope you bear with me. I hope that I explained that, because I know what it is I'm trying to say. I don't have any notes here or anything on that. I mean, I'm speaking kind of off the top. But I think it's very, very important, because I think in response to the emailer, I have to say that, given that analysis, then altruism on the one hand and self-interest on the other is not the same as Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. It's the same principle, but altruism does not go to the point of pure Gemeinschaft. Self-interest does go to the point, to the extreme of pure Gesellschaft. So I think that's the difference. I don't know. I hope that makes sense. But anyway, it's one of those things you can I probably have totally confused you now. There are probably some of you shaking your head and said, I'm tired. And I apologize for that. But maybe I can get into something a little bit lighter than that. That's kind of philosophy a little bit. But I think it's very important, because what we're doing is we're applying a theory to a situation, and we're creating meaning. We're making meaning. We're taking from a situation, from a theory, we are basically talking about its application in such a way that we're able to extract all of this meaning and all of this common sense from it. And the more we can do that, the better the theory is, the more effective and more valuable the theory is. So I think it's very important. We're at the bottom of the first hour, so we've taken 25% of our program and wasted it, so to speak. Anyway, let me go back and give you the email address again, as well as the phone number, and then we'll go on to the theme that we were beginning with last time we were together. The phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's area code 304-658-658-3333. And my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906, all one word, @gmail.com. To go back to what we were talking about the movement toward, or the origins of American independence, and I just kind of want to briefly touch on what we were talking about last time, and then get into the alternative of that. What we were talking about in a previous program that I think is very significant here is that the treatment of the movement towards American independence that all of us are familiar with is a treatment which is actually an approach to American independence. Most of us assume that because every textbook we've ever looked at is written from the same perspective, we most of us tend to assume that that's the story, that there's no alternative. And what I'm trying to suggest is it is a thesis. It has a point of view. It has a justification. There is rationalization behind it. It has an intent. And you can go all the way back to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence for the origins of that intent. Jefferson's goal in the Declaration of Independence was to make the case that the colonies' decision to declare independence was not something radical that they chose to do. It was something conservative that they were forced to do. And that if there's a culprit in this situation, it's Mother England. The idea being that as colonies within the empire, the citizens of these colonies were entitled to certain rights as English subjects. And that when England began to enact policies and laws and policies that began to treat the colonies differently than than England was treating its own citizens, the colonies were basically being rendered second class within the empire. Their rights were being violated. They were being taxed without representation. Their governments were being abolished without cause. Their rights to jury trial were being suspended without cause. And that aspects of the British Constitution itself were being violated willy-nilly, randomly, helter-skelter, by the policies and programs that were coming from the mother country. Now, we know, realistically, that as a result of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, these policies were coming from Parliament, not directly from the king. Because after 1688, with the Glorious Revolution, Parliament achieved legislative supremacy within British government, within England. And the king was rendered not as a figurehead as the queen is now. That comes later. Because the king makes a play after 1689 to get some of this authority back. And the situation I'm thinking of is George III in the early 18th century, in the 17 teens and 20s. The relationship between George III and Prime Minister Walpole, Robert Walpole, is very, very interesting, because the tension between them is based on this transition of power that occurred late in the previous century with the Glorious Revolution. When James II was brought into England and offered the crown as King of England in 1689, Parliament laid out the terms of the appointment. And when James II accepted it, he was effectively accepting parliamentary supremacy in England as the price for the throne. He was accepting the the English Bill of Rights of 1689. He had to endorse those, which basically gave Parliament the right to free speech and freedom of the press and the right to debate issues and the right to control budgets and various other things. So from that point on, the absolute power of the king existed no more. That doesn't mean that the king, in the first part of the 18th century, George III, that doesn't mean that George III accepted it without question. He basically tried to do whatever he could do to wrest some of that power back into the hands of the crown. And that's part of the story of the interrelationship and the tensions between him and Parliament, between him personally and Walpole, the Prime Minister. But that's British history. That's a story. The point I'm making is that in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, he blames every single act that England undertakes against the colonies. He blames it specifically on the king. And if you read the Declaration of Independence, the way it's phrased, it is phrased, he, meaning the king. He does this, he did that, he is responsible for this, he is responsible for that. When in fact we know that many of these things came directly from Parliament and didn't directly involve the king at all. But the point is, since most of the colonies derived their charters and thereby their rights from the king, then what they are suggesting is that if those rights are violated, it has to be the king that does it, because that means that the contract between citizen and governor, between British subject and king, was violated. And it was violated by the king, not by the colonies, the colonists themselves. So in reality then, what Jefferson is effectively doing is making a very solid case in the Declaration of Independence that if there's any responsibility or any blame for American independence, it does not rest with the colonies, it rests with the mother country. And that's the perspective that every one of the textbooks that any of us have ever studied American independence from, be it in grade school, middle school, high school, college, whatever, every one of them is written from that perspective. Every one of them contains the same thing. I don't know how many times I've seen students kind of shake their head and said, oh my God, again, we're going through the Proclamation Act, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, the First Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, independence. I mean, the scenario of events from 1763 to 1776 is so familiar to most students that they really don't, first of all, they don't really know it. They surely don't appreciate it, because it's almost something that they memorize, almost like the Pledge of Allegiance. They don't know what the Pledge of Allegiance says, they just say it. They don't know what any of these events mean, they just know that every one of these is kind of a rock on the road toward independence. The point that I wanted to make, hope I made the other day, and the point I want to reiterate here is, that is indeed a conscious thesis. It is not truth. It doesn't, and I'm not saying, by saying it is not truth, that doesn't mean that these things didn't exist. They did. But the fact that the whole story lies in looking at these particular issues and events, that is not valid. In a sense, that story is an example of what I used, the term that I used, the imperial school of American independence. It is an approach to American independence which assumes that the story behind American independence lies in the relationship between mother country and colonies. And you can just take each one of those events and look at each of them in detail. And the more detail you want on each event, that means that your story becomes longer and longer and longer, but it doesn't change. It's all based on the assumption that the mother country acts because it believes that it has the right to act as mother country under the theory of mercantilism, which suggests that as colonies of the mother country, these colonies were created primarily to serve the interests of the mother country, and by definition that means that the mother country is in charge. That ultimately the mother country England controls the shots. England acts, the colonists obey. That's the way the game is to be played. It's that simple. That is the imperial school. That it is the imperial relationship between mother country and colony that explains the story of American independence. There is another approach. It is not one that our textbooks are comfortable with. It is one that our textbooks have taken to include. Many of our textbooks, depending on how good they are, the better ones, include aspects of another story, but even then, the other story never takes precedence over the imperial school. In other words, usually the approach that is given in most textbooks, and the ones that are out today especially, have some aspect of what I call the internal revolution thesis, the internal revolution thesis. Most textbooks will contain elements of that, but the way they will present it is they will present it in the midst of the imperial story. And they will say, within certain colonies, there were these things going on. And it makes the story of independence in those colonies a little bit more complicated. But then the conclusion is reached that the imperial approach continues to be the valid one. I would like to suggest that there are many people, I happen to be one, who believe that the internal revolution thesis is really the one that makes the most sense to me. And I'm not here necessarily to sell it and to downplay the imperial one. What my goal is to present the internal thesis in such a way that, from your perspective, as people tuned into today's program, what I hope to do is take a story which you feel you know the plot, you know what it's all about. I hope that when you leave today, you won't be so sure anymore. I hope that you will leave today's program with questions. And things that you thought you were sure about, you're no longer sure about. I can't tell you for sure that this is it rather than that, or that that's it rather than this. What I can do is lay out as competently as I can the internal approach. And if I do a good job, it's going to sound credible to you. And if it sounds credible to you, it's going to basically open the imperial school approach, as far as you're concerned, enough to warrant more reflection and more research and some further inquiry. If I'm able to do that, I'm successful. That's my goal. My goal is not to give you answers. My goal is to suggest that there are and remain questions. And one of the things that we find in our approach to the study of history generally is that the very nature of a textbook is to suggest that there aren't any questions anymore, that all the major questions have been answered. What I'm here to tell you is that is not true. And that there are a number of issues here which remain at play. So the question then is, how do we, what's the best way to get into the internal revolution thesis? And this has been my strategy for a number of years in teaching. It's one of the things that has always bothered me. It's one of the things that got me into the internal revolution thesis. So I'll lay it out to you. I'll mention it to you this way. I'm going to give you a couple of dates. In the Continental Congress, in the Second Continental Congress, on June 7th, 1775, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia took the floor and made the following very well-known statement: that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And Richard Henry Lee's motion passed. The fact of the matter is, the decision of the Continental Congress in favor of independence was made on June 7th, 1775. This is 2 months after the evacuation of Boston on the 19th of April. 1775. Not to get contemporary, but I can make this point because I think it's very valid. The bombings at the Boston Marathon a couple of weeks ago. The Boston Marathon is scheduled in commemoration of the 19th of April, which is Evacuation Day. That's the day that Great Britain evacuated the city of Boston. That's after Concord and Lexington, when the British troops were defeated. They run, disjointed. They make it they run back. They are forced to scatter by the Minutemen, and they arrive. Those that are not killed or wounded make it back to Boston, and they pile on boats, and the British evacuate the city. And it's considered a victory for the American colonists. April 19th, 1775. Now, of course, you know that the Marathon bombing happened on the 15th, which is a Monday, and you know the reason for that is that we celebrate our holidays on Mondays so that we can have 3-day weekends. Now, we won't go into that, but we move our holidays around. One of them is Evacuation Day. The other day that we do, as you know, we in February we have what's called President's Day. And it's usually on the Monday, the second Monday in February, President's Day. Well, it's primarily to commemorate Washington's birthday, which is on February 12th, and Lincoln's birthday, which is on February 16th. Those used to be independent holidays for many school systems. What we've done as a society is take them, create one day called President's Day, and make it that Monday so that there'll be a 3-day weekend, and the stores will have sales, and automobile dealers will have special President's Day sales, and all the rest of it. So ultimately, we've taken these holidays and we've done with them what we choose to do. But be that as it may, the day in question is April 19th, 1775. That's the day that the British evacuate Boston. And once Continental Congress takes that and the debates happen within the Continental Congress, as a result of those debates, Richard Henry Lee makes the motion that the colonies are and of right to be free and independent states, and it passes on June 7th. Here's my question. We know that the Declaration of Independence, Independence Day in our country, is July 4th, 1776. I have to point out the obvious. June 7th, 1775 to July 4th, 1776 is 13 months. Here's my question. If Richard Henry Lee's motion for independence passes on June 7th, 1775, why does it take 13 months to make independence a reality? What's the holdup? There's a war going on. People are dying. The very first order of business that the Second Continental Congress takes up in May of 1775, after Concord and Lexington, is to deal with the reality that there is open warfare going on, that shots have been fired. Bunker Hill, Concord, Lexington. The first point of business that Congress is required to take on in the Second Continental Congress is to create an army and appoint someone to lead it, George Washington, as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. That's the first order of business of the Second Continental Congress. That happens in May 1775 as a result of actions in Massachusetts that occurred in April. And as an aside, the story, if you read the minutes of the Continental Congress on the selection of Washington as Commander-in-Chief, it's absolutely fascinating. when Congress makes the decision that they're going to, the following day, they are going to name the person who will head up the Continental Army, George Washington shows up that day in full uniform, with buttons polished, his militia uniform from the state of Virginia. And, you know, the stories of how humble he is are well known. But the fact of the matter is, when the decision is going to be made, he's in full uniform in order to receive the gratitude of the members of the Continental Congress. But even more interesting than that is that in order to get the decision for independence through, the people in Massachusetts knew that they had to have the support of the governor. But not the governor. They had to have the support of John Hancock. John Hancock does become governor of Massachusetts, but of course he's not in 1775 because there's still a royal governor there. But in order to get Hancock's support, members of the Continental Congress in Massachusetts make it clear that Hancock will probably be appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. And it's on that basis that Hancock supports independence. And according to John Adams, when he makes the motion that the Congress approve George Washington as Commander-in-Chief, Hancock is chairing the meeting. He is President of Congress at that time. And the stories are that Hancock is totally deflated, is totally destroyed, because he assumes it's going to be him. And when John Adams is making the introduction of George Washington, he's building up his reputation and his commitment to freedom and to people's rights and all of the rest of it. And Hancock believes that all the things that John Adams is saying to the Congress are about him, when in fact they're about Washington. But anyway, that's another story. The point I want to make is that Washington is appointed Commander-in-Chief in May 1775. He immediately heads to New England to take command of the Continental Army defending Boston. So the war is on as of May 1775. Yet independence, the Declaration of Independence, is not approved until July 1776. And the question that I have is why? What is going on in the Congress that takes 13 months to resolve before there's a willingness to approve a Declaration of Independence, when there's already a war going on? And the answer to that story, if you read the minutes of the Continental Congress and you read the letters of the members, the debate is over the pros and cons of the Declaration of Independence. It becomes very clear that there is a substantial number of members of Congress who do not want independence, who continue to want to find a way to mend fences with the mother country, who will do anything to avoid independence. And those who believe that are very prominent people. The most prominent is John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. He is one of the more conservative members of the House of the Continental Congress. But keep in mind, many members of the Continental Congress are conservative people. They are not revolutionaries. They are attorneys. They are ministers of the gospel. They are merchants. They are bankers. They are businessmen. They are, in the South, they are planters. They are very wealthy, prominent people who have been judges and members of their own colonial governments. I would suggest to you that radicals don't come from the kind of background that these people came from. These members of the Continental Congress were elected to serve their colonies because they were prominent people, because they were well known, because they were well connected, and for the most part, because they were well heeled. They had money, they had influence, they had prestige, they had power, they had culture, they had class, they had position. And now they're being asked to lead a revolution. And they're scared to death. And if you begin to look within the Congress itself as to who the people are who are most supportive of independence and who the people are who are opposed to it, you begin to see that the decision for independence is by no means unanimous. It is a very reluctant decision on the part of some. Now, granted, there are some people who worked actively to get a vote for independence for a long time. Sam Adams, John Adams, Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, Samuel Chase of Maryland, prominent Baltimore attorney, leading radical, if you will, within Maryland. Charles Carroll of Carrollton is a leading supporter of independence. He signs the Declaration of Independence. He's reputed to be the wealthiest man in America. He's a large planter and businessman. He owns incredible acreage in Maryland. So these people are pushing for independence. They would be people that you could call radicals, the ones who are pushing for independence. But for every one of them, there are at least as many pushing back the other way, the so-called conservatives. Let me finish. We're at 58 minutes after the hour, so let me read this definition for you, and then we'll take our regular 5-minute break at the top of the hour. I have in my hand a book on this period written in the 40s by Merrill Jensen, who was a prominent historian of the Revolution and Confederation period. The title of this book is The Articles of Confederation. Jensen was the first one to look at the Confederation period, at the Articles of Confederation. And he wrote this book. It received all sorts of awards. And Merrill Jensen was one of the most noted students, historians of the American Revolution that the country ever produced. One of the things that I have going for me is I was privileged, and I say this advisedly. I had no idea when I went to graduate school, and I was admitted into the seminar on the American Revolution with Merrill Jensen. I had no idea who Merrill Jensen was. I had no idea the number of graduate students from around the country who had applied for entry into his seminar and were denied admission so that I could get there. I can't believe it. And in the years that I was there, he and I became very, very close. Mr. Jensen passed away in the 80s, I believe 1983. I can honestly say that it's one of those times in your life when you really lost a friend. But Merrill Jensen is considered to be the person. When you're talking Articles of Confederation, you're talking Merrill Jensen. And in his book on the Articles of Confederation, he's the first one that makes the distinction over the issue of independence between radicals and conservatives. I want to read his definition. It's on page 10 of his book. It's the place that everybody goes. When there are excerpts of this book that appear in print, it always includes page 10, because Jensen's definition of the difference between radicals and conservatives around the issue of independence is a classic. And this is what Jensen says. The terms radical and conservative in this discussion are not synonymous with revolutionist and loyalist. So he's not talking between radical and conservative about those who want independence and those who remain loyal to the mother country. That they are not interchangeable is obvious from the easily demonstrable fact that there were in internal colonial politics some radicals who became loyalists and some conservatives who became revolutionaries. The interpretation of the revolution is too often confused by the insistence that all revolutionaries were radicals. Probably most radicals were revolutionary, but a large number of the revolutionists were not radicals. Now, here's the meat. The conservatives were those who, whether they desired independence or not, wanted to maintain the aristocratic order in the American colonies and states. They were conservative in that whatever they did not want to disturb the aristocratic order of society itself. They did not want to change the structure of the society the way it was currently organized. The radicals, on the other hand, were those who wanted changes in the existing order, changes which can be best described as democratic, though the term is necessarily relative. By and large, the majority of the colonial aristocracy was opposed to independence. This is important. By and large, the majority of the aristocrats of the colonial aristocracy was opposed to independence. This attitude was due partly to training, partly to self-interest, and partly, especially after 1774, to the fear that independence would result in an internal revolution. The radicals, on the other hand, shifted from mere opposition to British measures to a demand for independence as they came to realize that only independence would make possible the internal revolution which radicalism in the colonies had come more and more to demand. So those that Jensen calls, and that I'm calling radicals, had nothing to do with whether you wanted independence from the mother country or not. It had everything to do with whether you wanted there to be a revolution. If you wanted to change the structure of society, if you wanted to really create a society in which all men really were equal, if you wanted to take power from the few who had it and distribute it among all the people, most of whom didn't have it, if you wanted to abolish property qualifications for voting and office holding, if you wanted to turn the very structure of society upside down and come as close as possible to making a society where people really were equal to other people, then you were a radical. And if that was you, the aristocracy wanted no part of you. And the fact of the matter is, you as a radical began to realize very quickly that the only way that you could get what you wanted was to separate from the mother country and make sure that independence produced revolution. And if you were a member of the aristocracy, if you were an attorney or a minister or a prominent planter or a merchant or a banker or an insurance, a person in insurance and investment, if you were one of those that Madison called in 1787 the most considerate and virtuous citizens, then you knew the same thing. You knew that independence could produce revolution. And if you didn't want revolution, then you had to find ways to make sure that independence never happened. You had to find a way to maintain the connection with the mother country, because it was the existence of the mother country. It was the fact that you were a colony of England that meant that when push came to shove, however much change might happen within the colony, only so much was going to happen as long as the mother country was there to control it. But once you remove those controls, once you remove the British troops, once you remove the royal governors, once you remove the ability of Parliament and the King to make rules that governed the society you lived in, it was open season for change. And there was no way, in your view, that you could control what might happen. Rather than see the life that you knew and loved turned upside down, you were willing, more than willing, to make one more try, one more appeal, one more olive branch, one more supplication to the king to try to get the mother country to back off in order to make sure that what you were afraid might happen did happen. Didn't happen, rather. In order to prevent the revolution, you had to find a way to make sure that independence didn't happen. That was the difference between radicals and conservatives. 7 minutes after the hour, let's stop and take a break, 4 or 5 minutes. We'll be back about 12, 13 minutes after the hour, and we'll continue. I think this is a fascinating story. This is kind of where my bread is buttered. This is my area, so I love this. I love this stuff. I hope I'm able to present it in a way which you can kind of begin to love at least a little bit. We'll be back in a moment. This is Bill O'Brien, back with you here on the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution, where we're into the story of American independence, where today we're looking at the so-called internal revolution thesis, which probably more than anybody else is associated with the name Merrill Jensen. And as I mentioned, and I need to make my loyalties and my priorities as clear as I possibly can. I was a graduate student who studied the Revolution and Constitution with Mr. Jensen, with Merrill Jensen, and I am an acolyte. I am what the University of Wisconsin Graduate History Department refers to as a Jensen man, and proud of it. Very honestly, one of the people that I respect very, very much. I mentioned this before, and I don't mean to get off track, but I mentioned John Kaminsky before, who was editing for 38 years. He's been editing the ratification papers for the United States Constitution. It's a project that was originally assigned to Merrill Jensen, and when Mr. Jensen died, John was given the responsibility. He was associate editor with Mr. Jensen, and then when Professor Jensen died in, I believe, 1983, John Kaminsky was made editor, and he's been editor ever since then, 40 years ago. And I made mention of the fact that John Kaminsky has written, I think, 21 books related in some fashion to the Constitution of the United States. And what he's done is taken the knowledge that he has gained by editing the ratification papers, and he's published book after book after book. And, of course, many of them are source materials. It's not just John talking. Much of this is laying out the source materials that he's found in his research. And he and I both studied with Professor Jensen. And I have to say that if there's one thing that John Kaminsky's doing that Mr. Jensen didn't, Merrill Jensen has wrote some great books and articles during his life. The first one, the major one, was the Articles of Confederation. He wrote a book several years after that in the 1950s called The New Nation. Then he wrote a book in his later years, I believe in the 1970s, called The Founding of the American Republic, I believe. And he wrote a number of articles and various other things. But the thing that always bothered me a little bit is that Mr. Jensen left the earth with this tremendous knowledge that he had acquired over 65, 70 years of doing research. He was close to 90, I believe, when he passed away. And he took much of that knowledge with him. And the thing I admire about John Kaminsky is John's not letting that happen. John is putting it all out there, so when he leaves, what John knew, we're going to have access to, all of us. I wish Mr. Jensen had done a little bit more of that. I wish he had seen. He published, but he didn't put it out the way that John's putting it out, and I just think it's wonderful. But it's not a criticism. It's just a fact. We were talking about the internal revolution. I would love to hear from you if this is something that if you think about it, you probably knew it, because this isn't anything that if you spend a little bit of time thinking about it, makes perfect sense. But you may not have heard it before in these terms. So if you have a comment or you want to raise questions or offer contributions, by all means, we would love to hear from you. I understand we now have the capability of taking calls and putting them on the air and responding to them. The phone number is area code 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to address me directly, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's area code 304-658-3333 or waobrien906@gmail.com. I read Mr. Jensen's definition and explanation for radicals and conservatives, and I'm not going to go back into it again, but I made the point at the very end that if you wanted to make sure that there was not an American Revolution, you had to do everything in your power to prevent independence. Because once the mother country was removed from the equation, the fear was what was to control the amount of change that might happen during the transition from colonial status to the existence of independent states. That was the concern. So if you had that concern, if you were really afraid of a revolution, you had to be opposed to independence. On the other hand, if you wanted such a revolution, if you wanted that kind of a change, then you realized that the only way you were going to get it was with independence. Because as long as England was there, the amount of change that you could expect, independence or no, was limited. As long as England had the power to control change, the amount of change, then if you really were a radical, if you really did want a democratic society, if you believed that it was indeed possible to create a society in which all men were created equal, all men had certain rights, and it was government's responsibility to protect them, and government's power was not limited but absolute, not absolute but limited, if that was where you were coming from, then you wanted independence. But going back to Jensen's definition, his explanation, he makes it clear that there were some prominent people who wanted independence. So you have to ask yourself, if they were prominent people, why would they want independence? Why would they want to jeopardize the kind of society that had allowed them to achieve positions of prominence, whether it be as planners, as merchants, as bankers, as attorneys, as ministers, whatever. If you were a prominent person with position and influence and wealth, you owned land, you wielded influence in your community, and you wanted to preserve that, then it made sense for you to be opposed to independence. But the fact of the matter is, some people who fit that definition wanted independence. I mentioned Charles Carroll of Carrollton, considered to be the wealthiest man in America, and he was a leading advocate for independence in Maryland. He was in the Continental Congress from the colony of Maryland. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He stands out among the others because he was the only Roman Catholic in the crowd. Samuel Chase was considered to be the Maryland radical. He was a prominent attorney. One would assume that as a prominent attorney, he would be a conservative. Why would he endorse independence? John Hancock. John Hancock may not have been the wealthiest man in America, but he was one of the wealthiest men in America. He was reputed to be the wealthiest man in Massachusetts. He made a fortune in the shipping business, primarily as a smuggler. His father, Thomas Hancock, owned a shipping business in Massachusetts. And he turned it over to his son, John, and John made a fortune avoiding British taxes. The Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the tea tax, all of these things. Hancock made a fortune by not paying those taxes. So he was a criminal. If you accept the fact that England had the right to make laws for the empire, then John Hancock was a criminal. But he was a very wealthy man. Why would he support independence? Except that he didn't want to be tried as a criminal. That makes some sense. The point I would make is that there are examples of people in every colony who were prominent, well-to-do people among your so-called considerate and virtuous citizens who supported independence. Now, does that mean that they were willing to take the risk of revolution? No, not necessarily. These are people who believed in republicanism, in the ideal of Republican government. These are people who believed that you didn't necessarily risk revolution with independence. They believed that if you set up a solid, well-constructed political system, a government, if you wrote a constitution for your independent state, for your former colony, that incorporated the right protections and the right guarantees, you could indeed have independence without the risk of revolution. These people believed that a Declaration of Independence was not necessarily the abandonment of all law and order. They believed that the states were quite capable of managing their own affairs, writing constitutions, electing members of the legislature, and governing on a day-to-day basis without the power of England over their shoulder, and do it in a way which preserved order, preserved the existing society, and made sure that there was no such thing as a revolution. So they didn't want revolution any more than the real conservatives did, the John Dickinson crowd did, who went to any lengths to prevent independence in order to prevent the revolution. Just because you supported independence, that didn't mean that you wanted revolution, is what I'm saying. They put their faith in well-constructed constitutions and state governments as a way to control and maintain order and control change. So they were not radical people. But there's no question that the radicals were the ones who wanted revolution, who wanted change. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that they were poor people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by change. That doesn't mean that at all. Sam Adams, John Adams, these people were not radicals. John Adams was a Harvard graduate, an attorney. His parents wanted him to be a minister. He went to Harvard with the idea of becoming a minister. He was not a radical person. He had a very, very prominent wife, Abigail, that many of you know the letters of Abigail and John Adams. He had children, one of whom was John Quincy, who's going to be President of the United States. He owned a very substantial farm in Braintree, south of Boston. These people aren't radicals. These aren't the kind of revolutionary radicals that you think about when you think of bomb throwers and these kinds of people, the kind of person that set off the bomb at the Boston Marathon that just wants to create chaos and wants to destroy everybody who's in power and everybody who has influence and just wants to hurt innocent people in order to send a message and all these other, forms of psychosis. These are prominent, reputable people who are mainstays in their community. But many of them wanted change, and the change they wanted was to get rid of England. Because as long as the mother country controlled the empire, that meant that power within the colony was directly dependent on appointments from London. The king, Parliament, with the king's approval, appointed the governor. The governor of Massachusetts and many of the other states were appointed from England. They appointed the sheriffs and the tax collectors and the counselors and the local officials. So there was a whole power structure within colonial America. The positions of power and influence didn't necessarily go to the people, the most prominent people in the community. They went to the people who had connections in London. They went to the people who knew people. What we're talking about here is a power structure in America whose very existence was dependent on the mother country. What that meant was that the people within the colonies, however successful and prominent they were, could only go so far because the positions of power and influence were controlled by the empire. So even though you were a wealthy merchant or a prominent planter or an influential attorney, you could only go so far in terms of position and influence because the power structure was controlled from afar. If you declared independence, if you could find a way to get a vote for independence through the Continental Congress, then one of the things that independence would mean would be the removal of the entire British power structure and office-holding clan from the colonies. All the positions would open up. The sheriff's position, the councilor's position, the upper houses of the legislature, the lower houses of the legislature, county officials, county councils, all the positions that went to British placemen, friends of the governor, friends of the king, and all the rest of it, all of them would open up. And into these positions would move the Patrick Henrys and the John Hancocks and the John Adamses and the Samuel Chases and the Charles Carroll of Carrolltons and all the rest of them. So in a sense, what you had in colonial America by the 1770s was a vibrant, viable economic reality in the New World. You had merchants and bankers and potential. You had economic potential without the freedom and the opportunity to let it operate the way you believed it ought to operate, because everything was controlled from afar, from the mother country. So in a sense, even though you were a prominent person, you may have supported independence because independence would give you the opportunity to move into the positions of influence and power that you felt you had a right to. The positions that were closed to you as long as you remained a colony of the mother country. So it was self-interest. But there's no, for example, it is not an accident that the first governor of an independent Virginia is Patrick Henry. It is not an accident that the most prominent person in Massachusetts politics who becomes governor is reelected over and over and over again is John Hancock. He's one of the most popular politicians in Massachusetts. Charles Carroll of Carrollton becomes the dominant force in the Senate of Maryland. And he and Samuel Chase are at odds during the Confederation period, while they're allies over the issue of independence. So the point is that Jefferson couldn't have become governor of Virginia on the burning of Williamsburg, of the capital. Jefferson's the one that moves the capital to Richmond, further inland, during the Revolution. And then Patrick Henry becomes governor. They couldn't have done that if Virginia had remained a colony of the mother country. The governor would have been decided elsewhere for reasons other than your prominence within the colony. So there are a number of reasons, but the point I'm trying to make is, within every colony, every colony has its own story, its own internal story, its own internal political situation. There's a struggle for power going on within every colony between those who have it and those who don't have it. And once independence is on the table, once people start to talk independence, people like the Adamses and the Jeffersons and the Patrick Henrys and the rest of them begin to realize that independence has tremendous potential because it's going to wipe out the British power structure in America. It's going to make available positions that many of these people believe they ought to have a right to anyway. The way a society is organized is its most prominent people hold the positions of power. That couldn't happen as long as they remain colonies of the mother country. So these people become leaders of the independence movement. That doesn't mean that they're radicals. It doesn't mean that they're bomb-throwing revolutionaries. It means that they want change, but they want change that they control. One of the most fascinating stories, and it wouldn't make sense, but now it might. One of the most fascinating stories is the story of Sam Adams. There is no question that in Massachusetts politics, the driver for independence, the person most responsible for firing up the people against Great Britain and fomenting revolution within the state of Massachusetts is Sam Adams. He's a fascinating study in how to basically make a revolution happen. There was a very famous book written a number of years ago. It became popular in the 1960s during the Vietnam protests, called Rules for Radicals. The author was a radical named Saul Alinsky. Conservatives today continue to talk, and many of them believe that President Obama is getting a lot of his, that a lot of the Obama playbook, as it were, is out of Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. But what I'm suggesting is Sam Adams could have written that book, because Sam Adams knew how to make revolution happen. He made it happen. But the point I'm trying to make is, during the 1780s, when Hancock becomes governor, Sam Adams is lieutenant governor. And one of the most interesting things to behold is Sam Adams as lieutenant governor trying to tell the people of Massachusetts that all of that stuff that we were talking about before 1776 was merely rhetoric. The revolution happened, you got your revolution, you're now free, that's it. The revolution stops, change stops. In other words, he's lieutenant governor, that's it. Time to call it. Fascinating stuff. Fascinating. So that's the internal story. The fact of the matter is, and what makes the story of the American Revolution so fascinating, is that the conservatives are correct. Once independence is declared, it becomes very difficult to keep the lid on what happens, because you have to basically propagandize the movement. It's let's remember the old commercial about the politician. Let's let the politicians fight the next war. They're the ones that caused it. Let's make sure they fight it. The fact of the matter is, the people who cause revolutions are not the ones who fight it. The people are the ones who get in the trenches and fight the wars. And in order to basically win the war, in order to win independence, you have to promote the mission. You have to promote the movement. And in order to promote the movement, you've got to basically give people something to fight for. The war has to, the independence has to mean something. It has to stand for something. People have to believe that there's something to be gained for them. In this context, I ask you to consider Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths. I'm not reading this. When I was in school, you had to memorize this. I'm still remembering it, I think. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that in order to preserve these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And then the Declaration goes into the right of revolution if government oversteps its bounds. In other words, if government is not willing to live within the limits that the consent of the governed places upon it. What I'm asking you to think about is the substance of that passage. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. All men are created equal. And that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. equality comes before the rights. They are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Comes after all men are created equal. Do you think that's an accident? I don't. I believe John Adams. I believe that Jefferson wrote with a masterful pen. I believe that when he put down equality and the idea that all men had rights to life, liberty, and property that they received from God, and that government's responsibility was to protect those rights. What is the message that sends to the average people in the street? Many people believe that that's what the war's about. This is a war to create the ideal society. This is what a republic is. It's popular government, consent to the governed. The people call the shots. Government becomes the servants of the people who elect them. Government has obligations to me rather than me having obligations to it. The message that the decision to go for independence sends to the people is that this is a war that has to be won because it's a war that is going to lead people and give people the opportunity to create the ideal political system. It's the first time in the history of man that people are being given the opportunity to set up the government and make the rules that they will live by. It's a revisit to the charters that the colonists set up when they first came over here. It's the chance to create the kind of society that many people believe really is possible if you're willing to give it a try, and they think that that's what this war is about. And the fact of the matter is, if you're going to get people to give up their stability, leave their farms, take up weapons, and fight for independence against the British, people have to believe in something. So you got to sell this message. So the question is, how do you sell it and at the same time control it? How do you keep the movement from getting out of your control? How do you control a movement for independence in order to keep it from becoming a revolution? The most conservative people believe there's no way you can do that. That's why they'll do anything they need to do to prevent independence. Others believe that you can do it. If you set up the right state constitutions, you write the Constitution carefully, you draw up the rules very carefully, you preserve the existing order, but you do it without England. They believe you can do this. And then there are people who buy into the rhetoric, who believe that this is what it's about. Think of what you saw on television the night that Barack Obama was elected president in 2008. In the election of 2008. When he spoke on election night in Chicago. And people literally were crying. I remember on television, I remember seeing Jesse Jackson and Oprah Winfrey and people in tears because they never believed it was possible that a night like that would ever happen in the history of this country, that we would elect an African American as president of the United States. People really believe that the election of Barack Obama was the beginning of something very special in this country. And if there's any angst that's going on right now, people are beginning to look at the Obama administration with a sense of frustration and disappointment, because many of the things that they thought would happen with his ascension to the White House have not happened. Many people blame Republicans for it. Some people blame Obama for it. But the fact of the matter is, think about what people believed Barack Obama's election meant for the country. And you begin to get some idea as to what the average citizen believed independence meant for the country. And the question is, how do you control that? How do you keep a lid on that? And there are numerous quotes, numerous examples of people who are extremely frustrated during the War for Independence because they really see these ideas of equality go into people's heads. I tried to find the quote before I went on the air today, and I couldn't do it. But there's a quote out of Pennsylvania in 1776 where a statement is made in the Pennsylvania legislature, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't find the quote, but the statement goes something like this. There are people riding around the streets of Philadelphia in carriages with lace cuffs and buckles on their shoes, who 3 years ago were not worthy to shine my shoes. Who the hell do they think they are? And you can find example after example after example in private letters and papers and newspapers and everything else of examples of that kind of a statement where people are absolutely appalled because people who were always considered second class now begin to believe that they're equal to them. In other words, these are people who believe that the world we know it is gone. Or as the very famous musical piece goes, the world has turned upside down. I've got one such quote here, and this is a short one, but I wanted to share it with you anyway. It's a statement by a newspaper editor named Joseph Denny. He's a Philadelphia conservative. He is the editor, founder and editor of a publication called The Port Folly, which is produced after the Constitution. He's a very, very prominent Federalist, very prominent conservative. And early on, he's chastising those he calls revolutionaries in 1775 and 1776. And this is what he said. I always had a high admiration of your old Whigs of 1775, he told his parents, very sarcastically. But the measure of their folly was never completely filled till they gave tarts and tailors a civic feast and taught the rabble that they were all viceroys. Let me read that again, because he's talking to his parents. And he said, I always had high admiration of your Whigs of 1775, those that you used to consider heroes because they were instrumental in helping us gain our independence. But he said the measure of their folly was never completely filled. I really didn't appreciate how foolish they were until they gave tarts and tailors a civic feast and taught the rabble that they were all viceroys. Now that I look back and I realize that they are responsible for telling people who aren't worthy of being in the same room with me that they are indeed equal to me, now I begin to realize why they do not worthy of the praise that I've always been willing to give them. So the fact of the matter is, while Jefferson put equality at the top of at the top of the ladder, so to speak, in the Declaration of Independence. There are people all through American society who subscribe to the Declaration of Independence, who vote for it, who applaud it, who celebrate it, but they don't believe it. Do you? Do you believe that it's possible to create a society in which all men really are equal? Do you believe that everybody ought to be treated the same? Do you believe that everybody is worthy of being treated the same? Do you believe that people who won't work ought to be given the same credibility and the same response as people who work 2 jobs? Do you believe that people who spend their lives trying to find a way to get on the system so that they can remain on the public dole and not work, do you believe that they're equivalent to people who are willing to work for a living? Do you believe that people who are always looking to take the easy way out are as worthy of respect as are people who believe that you're only entitled to what you're willing to work for and no more? I would suggest to you that we're not talking about freaks in history here. We're talking about average, normal, ordinary people who are expressing their frustrations as well as their ideals, their hopes as well as their fears, their optimism as well as their pessimism. This is the internal revolution thesis. The fact that if you focus on the internal story in every colony, you begin to get a whole different appreciation as to why some people support independence and some people oppose it. And it has nothing to do with the mother country except indirectly. If you are an advocate of revolution, then you support independence, which means that you participate actively in attacking England for things like taxation without representation and the quartering of troops and the denial of the rights to a jury trial and all the rest of it. You become a leading voice in criticizing the mother country for what it does, not because you believe that the mother country has earned the hatred you're giving it. What your agenda is, you want independence because you want revolution, and you know the only way to get it is to build up hatred for the mother country to the point that independence is passed. So for you, the behavior of the mother country is not a reason for independence. It's an excuse for what you see as the real reason for independence, which is revolution. So you see the actions of the mother country not as a reason for the Declaration of Independence, but as a justification for it. So in other words, many people who are outspoken in their criticism of the mother country and their support for independence may not be speaking 100% truth by suggesting that independence ought to be the response to what England is doing. We have a right to independence because what England's doing. Many of them believe that independence is something they want for their own individual reasons. And in order to get it, you've got to attack England to get it. So for them, independence is not the end. It's not the goal. It's a means to an end. And the point I'm trying to make is, if you get into the internal story of what's going on within each colony, you can agree with the statement of the very famous revolutionary historian Carl Becker, who wrote the first full study on the Declaration of Independence. Carl Becker, he wrote his dissertation. He did the study of New York politics. And he wrote a study of independence within the colony of New York. And I think he entitled it "Political Parties in the State of New York for Independence," or something like that. I can't remember the exact title of his book. But Becker makes the point. There are two revolutions going on. One over the issue of home rule, in other words, whether power will be in England or whether power will be within the colony. One over the issue of home rule. The other over who will rule at home. In other words, who within the colony is going to call the shots and be in control. And Becker goes on to say there are two revolutions going on. The struggle between home rule and the struggle over who will rule at home. And if one had to make a choice as to which of the two was more important, Becker argues the second one is more important because you can't understand this first one until you know the second one. In other words, it's what's happening within the colony that dictates what happens in the struggle with the mother country. So in that sense, everything that England does in the imperial school, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Declaratory Act, the Tea Act, the Quartering Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, all of them, everything that England does can only be understood in the context of how it's received within the politics that's going on in colonial America. That's the internal revolution thesis. And it's fascinating. But we are at the end of our hour. It's 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you, and next time we'll continue this story a little bit. It's a great story. We'll continue it next time. For the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution, I'm Bill O'Brien. I want to thank you so much for being with us today, and I hope you join us again. Be safe, because we want to have you back with us. Thank you.